Well, today is Maundy Thursday, and something terrible happened at the Last Supper. Let's talk about it. Jesus' washing of the disciples' feet at the Passover meal is usually portrayed as a task he should not really have done. Because, well, it's a messy job, more suited to slaves or servants. But good on you, Jesus, for doing it, is sort of how we teach it. In normal years, unlike this one with the virus, this foot washing is reenacted out many times at Maundy Thursday services in churches and cathedrals up and down the country, with clean towels and warm soapy water, and no doubt those church members about to have their feet washed have washed them already. They're nice and clean. We do this to illustrate that Jesus was a servant, and so we shall serve others too. Well, this is okay, but I believe that what happened in that upper room was a much more powerful action than this. When Jesus took the place of the house slave on this Thursday evening, it was not just a bit embarrassing for Peter and the disciples. It was a shameful thing for them to be part of. Peter's reaction is not one of mild discomfort or embarrassment. He is horrified. Let's recap what happened. Jesus got up from the meal table and started to wash the disciples' feet, the scriptures tell us. And then when he came round to Peter, Peter kicked off big time. "You're not going to wash my feet, are you?" And Jesus says, "You don't get it at the moment, but in time you will." Peter says, "You will never wash my feet." And Jesus replies, "Well then, you've no part in me." Peter comes back and says, "Well, wash all of me, but not just my feet." And Jesus says, "No, Peter, just the feet." Peter steadfastly refuses to let Jesus touch his feet. If he really is going to do some washing, then it must be his entire body. So what is it about the feet? Why such a strong reaction? Well, we have to understand something of the etiquette of Middle Eastern culture. In Jesus' day, and still very much today, the feet were considered the lowliest and the most shameful part of the body. I'm not sure if you remember, but actually on this very day, the 9th of April in 2003, as part of the Gulf War, the victorious coalition troops entered Baghdad, and the statue of Saddam Hussein in the central square was pulled down in front of hundreds of Iraqis. The images were broadcast all over the world. As soon as the statue hit the ground, do you remember what the local people did to it? They hit it with the soles of their shoes and they kicked it with their feet. This was the ultimate insult to a ruler who had oppressed them. A few years later, 2008 to be precise, George Bush was in Baghdad for a press conference, and an Iraqi journalist threw his 2 shoes at George Bush. It's called shoeing, an act of insult towards the president. And in fact, you can find it in the Bible as well, if you have a look at Psalm 108. When I lived in Birmingham, in a mainly Muslim neighbourhood, I learnt that I should not sit in someone's home or in a mosque with the soles of my feet pointing outwards towards other people. It wasn't just impolite, it was rude. The insult of the feet is so bad because they are viewed in Eastern culture as the part of the body which carries the shame. To put it more bluntly, in our culture, we find it shameful if somebody exposes their genitals in public. And maybe the greatest act of shame in our culture would be for someone to urinate on someone else or something important. It's a terrible thing to do. A few years ago now, a student at Southampton University, who came from the town where I lived at the time, Macclesfield, was photographed urinating on the cenotaph in Southampton while out on a drunken pub crawl. The press got hold of the story. It was rightly regarded across the town as an act of greatest disrespect. He shamed himself, he shamed his family, and he shamed our town. When Jesus put himself in the position of the foot washing slave, there was much more to this action than washing hot, smelly feet after a long day on the road. Jesus was shaming himself, and Peter was shamed because of the action done to him. Peter couldn't handle it, and neither can we, but Jesus can. Because we cannot cope with the possibility of shame, we'd rather be successful and well regarded, looked up to and admired, but not shamed and humiliated. Sometimes our shame can be so unbearable that some would rather die than face it. In 2009, a terrible example of this hit the news. I wonder if you remember it. A millionaire named Christopher Foster had got himself and his family into a terrible financial mess. To all outward appearances, he looked successful, the family was good looking, they were glamorous, they're having a great time. But the truth behind the scenes was he was going bankrupt. But he couldn't face the humiliation of being a failure and not keeping his image going. So one evening, he decided to end it all. He took a gun and murdered his wife and 15-year-old daughter. He then shot their pet dogs, their 2 horses, and set fire to his £1.2 million mansion and the paddock before committing suicide himself. He just couldn't face his shame. He chose to end it all instead. For him, that was easier. Maybe our actions are not quite as extreme, but still, we can't handle shame either. Jesus' action in the upper room was a really significant action. Not only did he demonstrate that he was a servant king or slave king, but also that he could handle anything we might regard as an attack on our pride, self-respect, or ego. He demonstrated that while we cannot handle our shame, he can handle our shame. So Jesus, our king or emperor, is very different to those we see in the world in positions of leadership and power: monarchs, dictators, chief executives, politicians or leaders, those leading inside or outside of the church. Jesus the King is not offended or reduced in stature by shame. We'd be offended, as Peter clearly was, and we often are offended. One of the clearest ways to judge how we are progressing on the journey of life is to see how offended we get. The mature person rarely gets offended, if ever. That's when we can say they are full of God's Spirit. Jesus did get offended, but it's interesting by what he got offended. There were 3 things. He was offended by the rich exploiting the poor. He was offended by powerful people exploiting and oppressing vulnerable people, including women in New Testament. And he was offended by religious people acting as if they were superior to others. He was never offended by what people said about him or what they did to him, only what they did or said about other people. So this hard teaching ends with the master saying, "So, If I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. So, if I, your Lord and teacher, can carry others' shame, so you ought to as well, to help reduce their burden and load. So if I, your Lord and teacher, can choose not to be personally offended, so you ought to too, and not take yourself so seriously. So if I, your Lord and teacher, can handle humiliation, so you ought to too. It is only your ego that is fighting to keep its reputation. So if I, your Lord and teacher, well, we ought to as well. The next day, Jesus demonstrated big time that not only can he handle the cultural shame of foot washing, but the shame and sin of the entire world without any offence. Let me end with a collect for Maundy Thursday. Lord of Passover, you did not flinch when you touched feet, washed feet, or sat with feet in your lap. These symbols of shame were not repugnant to you, nor were they defiling. If you, our Lord and teacher, can bear such humbling, then teach us to carry the shame of others and help reduce their burden, for we are not more mighty than anyone we may encounter. Amen.